The moment Johnny Cash's voice cracked at Folsom Prison, 2,000 hardened criminals went silent, not the respectful quiet of an audience. This was different. This was the silence of men who just witnessed something break inside the man in black. His guitar hung loose against his chest, fingers frozen on the strings, as if the very notes had betrayed him. The warden, a fictional character named Marcus Stone, stood in the shadows with his hand on his radio, ready to shut it all down. But what happened in the next 7 seconds would become the most legendary moment in prison concert history, a moment the guards tried to erase from the recordings. You see, Johnny Cash wasn't supposed to be at Folsom that day. 3 hours earlier, his manager, let's call him Frank Morrison, had begged him to cancel. Cash's hands were shaking from withdrawal, his voice raw from sleepless nights. And there was something else, something about a letter he'd received the night before, signed only with a number 2847. That was an inmate's number, an inmate who'd been waiting 7 years for this exact moment. The morning had started wrong. Cash's black suit was damp with sweat before he even left the hotel. June, though not present, had called him 6 times, each call going unanswered. She knew what this concert meant to him, but she also knew what it might cost. The pills in his pocket rattled like dice as he walked, each step toward Folsom feeling heavier than the last. Morrison kept talking about insurance, liability, the risks of performing for men who'd killed without hesitation. But Cash wasn't listening. His mind was on that letter, on those 4 numbers that somehow held more weight than any name ever could. But here's what nobody tells you about that day. When Cash arrived at Folsom's gates, the air itself seemed to thicken. The guard towers loomed like tombstones against the California sky. Warden Stone met him at the entrance, his fictional presence commanding yet nervous. "Mr. Cash," he said, voice tight, "there's been a situation. Inmate 2847. He's refusing to leave his cell unless you play one specific song." Cash's jaw tightened. He knew which song. It was the one he'd sworn to June he'd never play again. The one that came from the darkest chapter of his life, when the pills owned him more than he owned himself. The walk to the prison cafeteria felt like a funeral march. Each checkpoint, each steel door slamming behind them, reminded Cash that he was walking into a cage, maybe not as an inmate, but certainly not free. The fictional guard captain, Roy Davis, whispered to another officer, $10, says the old man doesn't make it through the first song. They didn't know Cash could hear them. They didn't know that doubt was already eating him alive from the inside. Morrison pulled Cash aside in the hallway, sweat beading on his forehead. "Johnny, listen to me. We can still call this off. Say you're sick. Say anything. These men, they're not your usual crowd. They're killers, Johnny. Real killers." But Cash just stared through him, seeing something Morrison couldn't. The ghost of who he used to be, before the fame, before the black suit became armor against a world that wanted to own him. "They're men," Cash said quietly. "Men who know what it's like to be written off. I'm playing." "Stop. Because what you don't understand yet is why this concert mattered more than any other. 7 years. That's how long inmate 2847 had been writing to Cash. Not fan letters, confessions, each one signed with just his number. Each one describing how Cash's music was the only thing keeping him from ending it all in that 6x8 cell. The fictional prisoner, whose real name was Thomas Wade, had killed a man in a bar fight, self-defense, he claimed, though the jury didn't buy it. But that wasn't the secret that would shatter the silence in mere minutes. As Cash entered the cafeteria, 2,000 faces turned toward him like sunflowers to light. Murderers, thieves, rapists, society's discarded souls, all united in this moment by something they couldn't name. The makeshift stage looked like a gallows, 3 feet high, spotlights harsh as interrogation lamps. Cash's band was already set up, but their faces showed the fear Morrison had voiced. Luther, the fictional drummer, kept glancing at the exits. Pete, on base, had his back to the wall. Cash climbed those 3 steps like they were mountains. The microphone waited like a confession booth priest. He could feel inmate 2847's eyes on him, though he couldn't pick him out of the crowd. The letter had been specific. Play it during Folsom Prison Blues. You'll know when. You'll know because your voice will tell you the truth you've been hiding from. Cash's hand trembled as he gripped the microphone. The warden's hand hovered over his radio, ready to cut the power at the first sign of trouble. "Hello," Cash said, his voice echoing off concrete walls that had heard every kind of scream except joy. "I'm Johnny Cash." The roar that erupted could have torn down walls, but Cash wasn't hearing the cheers. He was hearing the silence underneath them. The desperate hunger for something real in a place built on lies. Lies told in courtrooms, lies told to families, lies men told themselves to survive another day in hell. But the real shock came when Cash started the first song. He didn't start with Folsom Prison Blues. He went straight for Hurt. The song he'd promised never to play. The one that stripped him naked of all pretense. The inmates didn't know the history. How he'd written it in a fictional motel room after June found him unconscious. Pills scattered like accusations across the floor. How the fictional doctor, Richard Hayes, had given him 6 months to live if he didn't stop. How this song was his confession, his prayer, his goodbye letter all at once. The first verse came out strong. Cash's baritone filling the space like smoke. But somewhere in the second verse, something shifted. His voice caught on the word empire. My empire of dirt. And suddenly he wasn't singing to inmates. He was singing to himself. To every mistake. Every pill swallowed in darkness. Every time he'd chosen the numbness over feeling. That's when he saw him. Inmate 2847. 3rd row center. Eyes locked on Cash, like he was watching his own execution. The fictional Thomas Wade wasn't what Cash expected. Young, maybe 30, with scars that told stories his mouth never would. But it was the tears streaming down a face that probably hadn't cried since childhood, that made Cash's voice crack completely. The silence hit like a sledgehammer. 2,000 men who'd survived prison riots, who'd faced death sentences, who'd forgotten what mercy looked like, all frozen in absolute stillness. The guards' hands moved to their weapons, thinking this was it, the moment of violence they'd been trained for. But violence wasn't coming. Something else was, something none of them had protocols for. Wait, what you're about to hear changes everything about that day. Cash's guitar slipped from his hands, clattering against the microphone stand, with a feedback shriek that nobody moved to stop. His knees buckled slightly, and Morrison started forward from the wings. But Cash raised one hand. Stop. His eyes never left inmate 2847, and in that stare was recognition, not of the man, but of something deeper. I know you, Cash whispered into the microphone, though he'd never met Thomas Wade before. I know you because I am you. Warden Stone's fictional hand tightened on his radio. This wasn't in any plan, any approved set list. The fictional prison psychiatrist, Dr. Carol Reeves, watching from the back, would later write that she'd never seen 2,000 men hold their breath simultaneously until that moment. Cash stepped away from the microphone, walked to the edge of the stage. No guitar, no protection, just him and his black suit like armor made of shadows. 7 years ago, he said, voice raw, a man wrote me a letter, no name, just a number, 2847. The crowd stirred, heads turning to find the man Cash was staring at. He told me he'd killed someone, told me he was dying inside these walls, not from violence, but from the weight of what he'd done. Thomas Wade stood up slowly, and every guard in the room tensed. But he wasn't moving toward Cash. He was just standing, bearing witness to his own revelation. But here's the part that still haunts everyone who was there. The man he killed, Cash continued, his voice breaking again, was my cousin, David Cash, my blood. The cafeteria erupted, not in violence, but in shocked murmurs. Morrison looked like he'd been punched. The band stopped pretending to play, instruments hanging useless. Even Warden Stone's fictional authority seemed to crumble in the face of this revelation. David was drunk, Cash said, each word like pulling nails from his own coffin. Mean drunk like our grandfather, like I used to be. He went after Thomas here with a bottle. Would have killed him if Thomas hadn't fought back. The court didn't care about context. Just the result, a dead Cash and a living nobody. Thomas Wade's legs gave out. He collapsed back onto the bench. 2,000 pairs of eyes, now ping-ponging between him and the man in black. The fictional guard captain Davis reached for his radio, but Warden Stone shook his head. Let it play out. I hated you, Cash said directly to Thomas. For 7 years, every letter you sent, I burned, until last night. Last night I finally read one. And you know what you wrote? You wrote that my music was the only thing keeping you from becoming the monster they said you were. That Folsom Prison Blues reminded you that even in hell someone understood. Cash walked back to the microphone, picked up his guitar with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. So here's the thing about that song you requested, Thomas. The one I swore I'd never play. I'm going to play it now. Not for you, not for them, but because sometimes the only way to kill a demon is to sing it to death. Stop right there. Because the song wasn't what anyone expected. It wasn't a Cash classic. It was something new, something raw, something he'd written in the car, that very morning after finally reading Thomas Wade's letters. The fictional song, which would never be recorded, never be released, existed only in that moment for those 2,000 witnesses. The first chord rang out like a judge's gavel. Cash's voice, when it came, wasn't the polished baritone of recording studios. It was rough, honest, broken. There's a man in number 2847, says he killed someone like me. The lyrics carved through the cafeteria, like prophecy. Each verse detailed Thomas's story, David's story, Cash's own story of addiction and violence barely contained. The fictional Dr. Reeves would later testify that she'd never seen group therapy work as fast as that song did. Hardened killers were crying. Men who hadn't spoken in years were mouthing along to a song they'd never heard before, but somehow knew by heart. But then, midway through the third verse, it happened again. Cash's voice didn't just crack, it shattered. The word was forgive. Can a man like me forgive? And suddenly, Cash wasn't singing at all. He was sobbing. The man in black, the outlaw country legend, the voice of rebellion, was crying in front of 2,000 criminals. And not a single man laughed. This is where everything could have gone wrong. The fictional Morrison was already on his phone, calling for backup, sure this was about to turn into a riot. Warden Stone had his finger on the lockdown button. The guards were calculating angles of fire if the crowd rushed the stage, but the crowd wasn't rushing anywhere. Instead, something unprecedented happened. Thomas Wade stood up again, steady this time, and began to sing. Not well. His voice was rough from years of silence, but he sang the chorus Cash had just taught them. Stone walls and steel bars can't hold the guilt inside. Then the man next to him stood and joined in. Then another, and another. Within 30 seconds, 2,000 inmates were standing, singing a song that didn't exist until 5 minutes ago, their voices creating a harmony that seemed to shake the very foundations of Folsom Prison. The guards didn't know whether to be terrified or amazed. The fictional camera operator, hired to document the concert, would later say his footage was unusable because he couldn't keep the camera steady through his own tears. Cash stood at the center of it all, guitar hanging loose, tears streaming into his black shirt, as 2,000 men gave him back his own broken song, transformed into something else, not pretty, but beautiful in its absolute honesty. But wait, because the most important moment was still coming. As the singing died down, as men sat back onto benches, emotionally exhausted, Cash did something that would become legend. He stepped off the stage. Morrison tried to stop him. The guards definitely tried to stop him. But Cash walked straight into the crowd, toward Thomas Wade. The sea of inmates parted like something biblical. Nobody touched him. Nobody moved, except to clear his path. The fictional tension was so thick you could taste it. Metal, and sweat, and fear, and something else. Hope, maybe, or grace. Cash stopped directly in front of Thomas Wade. Inmate 2847. The man who'd killed his cousin. They stood there, predator and prey. Except nobody could tell which was which anymore. The entire cafeteria held its breath. Even the fictional birds outside seemed to stop singing. Then Cash did it. He held out his hand. Thomas Wade looked at that hand, like it was a miracle or a trap. His own hands, marked with prison tattoos and scars from 7 years of surviving, shook as he reached out. When their hands met, killer and victim's cousin, prisoner and free man, broken and broken, the sound that erupted from 2,000 throats wasn't quite a cheer. It was deeper, primal, the sound of witnessing something that shouldn't exist, but did. "I forgive you," Cash said, loud enough for only Thomas to hear. But somehow everyone knew what had been said. Thomas Wade collapsed. Not dramatically, just his knees giving out. Cash catching him, holding him up while this convicted killer sobbed into the shoulder of the man in black. And still, nobody moved, nobody mocked. 2,000 men who'd been taught that tears were weakness, watched a man fall apart and be held together by someone who had every right to let him fall. "You think you know how this ends? You're wrong." Warden Stone, the fictional authority who'd run Folsom with iron control for a decade, made a decision that would cost him his job within 6 months. He walked onto that cafeteria floor, past his own guards' shocked faces, and spoke into his radio, canceled the remainder of the security protocols. Let them have this moment. Cash helped Thomas back to his bench, then returned to the stage. But the concert was effectively over. Oh, he played more songs. Ring of Fire, Walk the Line, even finally Folsom Prison Blues. But everyone knew the real concert had already happened. The moment when music stopped being performance and became communion. As the last notes faded, as Cash prepared to leave, Thomas Wade stood one more time. "Mr. Cash," he called out, voice carrying across the cafeteria. Cash turned. "That song you just sang. The one about me. What's it called?" Cash looked at him for a long moment. Then at the 2,000 faces waiting for an answer. "It's called The Man I Killed Was Me," he said. "Because that's what we're all doing in here, isn't it? Killing the men we used to be, hoping something better takes their place." The fictional Dr. Reeves would later note that suicide attempts at Folsom dropped by 60% in the months following that concert. The warden was indeed transferred, officially for security breaches, unofficially for allowing humanity to infiltrate a system built on dehumanization. Morrison never booked another prison concert, too shaken by what he'd witnessed. But here's the detail that changes everything. 3 weeks after the concert, Cash received one final letter from Thomas Wade, but this time, it was signed with a name, not a number. It contained just one paragraph. "You said you forgave me, but that wasn't the miracle. The miracle was that for the first time in 7 years, I forgave myself. You didn't just sing to us, Mr. Cash. You gave us permission to be human again, even if just for an hour." Cash never released "The Man I Killed Was Me." The fictional song existed only in that moment, for those men, in that place where redemption wasn't supposed to be possible. But every man who was there remembered it. In prison yards across America, the fictional legend spread, the day Johnny Cash's voice broke, and in breaking healed 2,000 others. The official recording of the Folsom Prison concert, the one you can buy, the one that made history, It's edited. The moment when Cash's voice cracked, when he cried, when he walked into that crowd, it's all been cut. Warden Stone, before his transfer, made sure of that. Some things, he said in his fictional exit interview, are too pure for the outside world. Some moments belong only to the men who lived them. But Morrison kept a copy, the unedited version, and sometimes, late at night, he plays it. Not the music, that's secondary. He listens to the silence, that perfect, impossible silence, when 2,000 hardened criminals stopped being prisoners and became witnesses to something larger than themselves. The truth nobody wants you to know. Cash never talked publicly about what really happened at Folsom that day. In interviews he'd say it was moving or powerful, but never the truth. Never about Thomas Wade, about the forgiveness, about the song that existed for 30 minutes and then vanished like grace itself. June knew, though. The night Cash came home, she found him in their bedroom, still in his black suit, holding his guitar like a life raft. "Did you play it?" she asked, meaning the song he'd promised never to perform. "I played something better," he said. "I played the truth." The fictional Dr. Reeves tried for years to get funding for a study on what she called the Folsom effect, the therapeutic power of that single concert. But nobody wanted to hear that criminals could be healed by a country singer's tears. It didn't fit the narrative. Prisons were for punishment, not redemption. Music was entertainment, not medicine. But Thomas Wade knew different. Every year on the anniversary of that concert, he would stand in his cell at exactly 10 a.m., the moment Cash's voice broke, and sing that song that didn't exist. Other inmates would hear him, and some would join in, this ghostly chorus of men singing words that were never recorded, honoring a moment that officially never happened. When Cash died in 2003, Thomas Wade was still in Folsom. The fictional record shows he was given special permission to listen to the radio that day, to hear the tributes, but he didn't need to. He had something better than recordings. He had the memory of the day the man in black looked him in the eye and chose forgiveness over fury. Johnny Cash, Thomas told his cellmate that night, didn't just sing about shooting a man in Reno just to watch him die. He sang about what happens after, the living death that follows, and the impossible possibility that even that can be redeemed. Here's what will haunt you forever about this story. The morning after the concert, Cash woke up convinced it had been a dream. The emotional weight of it seemed impossible to have actually carried. Morrison had to show him the fictional footage, the part that would never be released, to prove it had really happened. And when Cash watched himself break down, watched himself forgive, watched 2,000 men stand and sing a song that didn't exist until that moment, he said something that Morrison never forgot. "That wasn't me up there. That was every broken thing inside me finally getting to speak." The guards who were there, the fictional ones who'd placed bets on Cash not making it through the first song, never talked about it afterward. Not because they were ordered to keep quiet, but because how do you explain seeing 2,000 convicted killers become a choir? How do you tell your family that you watched the impossible happen, and your only job was to not stop it? Some moments are too big for words. Some truths are too raw for the world outside prison walls. But every man who was in that cafeteria on that day in 1968 knows what really happened when Johnny Cash's voice cracked at Folsom Prison. They witnessed a resurrection, not of the dead, but of the living dead, men who'd been written off by society, by their families, by themselves. For 1 hour, in that cafeteria that smelled like desperation and industrial disinfectant, they got to be human again. And it all started with a voice crack, a moment of imperfection that became perfect grace. Cash never went back to Folsom. He didn't need to. What happened that day couldn't be repeated, only remembered. And in cells across America, men who weren't there still tell the story, each time adding their own details, their own hopes, their own need to believe that redemption can happen even in the darkest places. The final truth that explains everything. 6 months before he died, Cash received one last letter. Thomas Wade had been released, served his full sentence, walked out of Folsom, a free man. The letter contained a photo, Thomas with his fictional daughter, a girl who'd been born while he was inside, who'd grown up with a father she could only visit through glass. Mr. Cash. The letter read, "She knows the song, the one that doesn't exist. I taught it to her. Someday when she's older, I'll tell her about the day her father was forgiven by the cousin of the man he killed. I'll tell her about the day the man in black taught me that we're all just broken people, trying to find our way home. Thank you for cracking. Thank you for breaking. Thank you for showing us that the cracks are where the light gets in." Cash kept that letter in his guitar case until the day he died. June found it there, along with a note in Cash's handwriting. The concert that mattered most was the one nobody will ever hear. And now you know why that silence at Folsom Prison lasted exactly 7 seconds. 1 second for each year Thomas Wade had been writing to the man whose cousin he'd killed. 7 seconds where 2,000 men held their breath and witnessed what forgiveness looks like when it costs everything. 7 seconds that changed nothing officially, and everything actually. 7 seconds when the man in black stopped being a legend and became something more dangerous, more necessary. He became human. And in that humanity, 2,000 forgotten men found their own.